Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to the stream. It's been when was the last time we talked? It was
I don't
Recording
recall.
in progress.
You
it's
tell
been
me.
yeah, it's been I think it's been a bit. Yeah, you're probably much more busy than me. I should know this. But it's always a good time talking.
Yeah,
Uh
absolutely.
sure, let's get right into it. So, you made some really cool changes in season 4 of this expansion where you made a lot of the Mythic Plus stuff. People were really averse to timers, so you made all the way up to what used to be a Mythic 10 on not on a timer, and the new Mythic Zeros are about at that level. So the difficulty was increased, and then in this season 4, the rewards were increased. But going into the War Within, I believe how it is currently is they were knocked down an upgrade track. So I'm asking, I guess if that was intentional, and if it was, what's the reasoning behind Mythic Plus's difficulty being increased, and instead of dropping Champion track gear when it's the only thing to do in that week with Heroic Raid, down to Veteran?
Yeah, so like you mentioned in season 4, there was a lot of changes, and going into the War Within season 1, there are going to be additional changes. And one of the big things that I think I'm not sure that we've even talked about it that much, or it's been reported, but
Yeah.
Mythic Zero is actually moving to a daily lockout, right, rather than weekly, which is a really big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to make sure to be careful not to overshadow like raids entirely, given that like a normal raid and like you mentioned that other upgrade track would be very very similar, and that given you can do Mythic Zero daily, that is something that we wanted to be careful of. Ultimately, like when we think about rewards and item level, there's almost like an equation that you can think about, or in terms of like determining the item level of the gear, which is essentially, like what's the challenge, right? Like how hard is this thing? What is the frequency, right? Like how often can you do it? Is it weekly, like raids or the Great Vault? Is it daily, like Mythic Zero will be in War Within Season 1? Or is it completely spammable, right? And then finally, it's, essentially coordination, right? Like, is this a solo activity like Delves? Is it group like Mythic Zeros? Or is it a raid that requires multiple groups? And essentially, as we were reviewing kind of the rewards across all difficulties and all keystone levels in the new system, we wanted to kind of take a more thorough pass at that and take a step back and look at where we felt that should align on essentially the item level track.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it makes sense. So you're going into the week, and if you want normal raid, you don't want normal raid gear to be completely overshadowed by a daily lockout Mythic thing. Because I know you dealt with that, I think, with Heroic. With simultaneous release in this expansion, you were like, Heroic Raid kind of lost its place because you could infinitely farm Mythic Plus gear at the same track. It's probably a way to also avoid a situation like that, I assume.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. So a lot of cool stuff with Warbands this expansion. Just wanted to bring up one thing that I know was something that was really talked about in the last few seasons, and I don't know if it's been clarified. There's been other ways to kind of deal with this, but I just want to ask it. So like, there's ways to send Woo gear or Warbound until equipped to your alt, which is a cool way to like kind of get them ready to go before you like really start investing time in them. But I was wondering if there was any plans to add some kind of like Crest Catchup system for alts, and or a like an upgrade cost reduction. Like if your main is already max upgraded or something, if you're starting to play an alt, maybe you don't have to go through that same road. Maybe you don't have to farm 100, Mythic plus 10 dungeons to get enough aspect crest. Like, is there some way to shorten that road through the warband system planned?
Right. Yeah. Separately, I love that Woo has been catching
it's
on.
good.
I wasn't sure if that was going to happen. Anyways, yes. I am mostly sure we haven't announced this, but I always like to give you scoops. We are going to be adding, essentially, like you mentioned, a catch-up system for Mythic Plus, and giving you a discount on upgrading gear, a crest discount essentially. And the specifics aren't entirely nailed down, but essentially, when you have outgrown a crest level, and we normally accompany that with like an achievement, that'll unlock across your whole warband a discount to upgrade that character. I think ultimately you're asking about like, hey, we added the myth track got longer, which meant progression got longer.
Correct.
Turns out when you add more item upgrade levels, progression should take longer, or does take longer, and in a lot of cases should take longer. But when we took a step back and we're like, all right, a lot of people who love Mythic Plus and love alts, and especially with Warbands being such a big feature of this expansion, that maybe that first time through should have a bit longer of a tail of the progression, but let's make sure that on your other characters, it's not quite as long.
That is the best answer I could have possibly hoped for. That is like probably the thing I'm the most passionate about, because there's multiple times the last couple patches where I'm like, I'm so ready to play this alt, and then you just look at that road and you're like, that's such a long road to get where I want to be at, and that is an unbelievable. So you said both that there is well, I know it'll probably be fully fleshed out when it's like announced, I guess, but you're saying that there's potentially both an upgrade cost reduction if your another character in your account has achieved some kind of achievement to prove that you have gotten to that point at some point already, and then also you could be getting more crests as you're farming. Both?
No, you just made that up. You're trying to like
I did
Inception.
No,
me right
I thought
now.
I heard that. No, I mean, okay, so it's just the upgrade cost reduction potentially.
Yeah. I
Okay.
think I want to say it's like a 30% off the top of my head.
Okay, that is the best news I could hear today, most likely.
Sweet.
Okay, so a question on raid buffs. So recently, like raid buffs have gone through a pretty interesting road in the last couple of expansions, right? Like there was like half of them, and then a lot of people got them, and then very recently it was like shamans kind of felt like they were the odd man out with only one of their specs having one. They were given one. And then it kind of made me think about how raid buffs have an impact on other areas of the game. I remember speaking with you, I think it might have been Ian in an interview, but I know it was definitely Ian at BlizzCon, where I was like, like what is like the point of really raid buffs? And really, I think this has been stated in interviews as well, where it really exists. So when you're doing the hardest raid content in the game in a mythic raid, we would like you ideally to want at least one of every class. Like that kind of diversity is good. You can clarify that if that's as well. I think
it was a Wowhead article that
yes.
Ian and I were in, but I don't think it mentioned the hardest difficulty, just raids in general.
Oh, just
having
raids.
At least one represented across classes. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So when thinking about that, I was also thinking about its relation to Mythic Plus. So in a way, a raid buff, maybe in a perfect world, not exactly, should be something like it is good enough sufficiently to get you a spot in a raid. Whatever you bring is good enough to actually, because that's like the whole point, right? But then how much better it is than that is kind of up to question. So like in this expansion particularly, there's been a few classes that have been, I know the Mythic Plus meta is always super weird. There's so few specs that can be a part of it, and there's so many specs in the game. Like, how do you balance how good raid buffs are in Mythic Plus, right? Like something like Mark of the Wild or Fortitude or the interaction between Arcane Intellect and Augmentation Evokers, like that kind of thing. Do you guys ever consider the power of them after the point where they have dictated your raid spot and how much it can impact the dungeon environment?
Right. There's always like a question within a question, I feel like.
Sorry.
Yeah, there are definitely, some mythic buffs, especially when you look at, the very, very high-end groups like yours and, the poddyc people who play, I would argue, a very different game than a lot of the people who are running Mythic Plus.
Definitely, yeah.
I think a lot of these people are primarily playing to, fill up their vault or to get some items for the week. But there are definitely some Mythic Plus buffs that feel like they can lock you into a comp potentially, right? Especially, like I said, for you and other really, really high-end players. I think things like Arcane Int are an interesting one to look at, right? That is not only 5% spell power, but it's also double dipping in a way because it's also healer throughput, right?
Mm-hmm.
At which point that also says, okay, well, we're doing extra magic damage. Chaos Brand is doing extra magic damage. And when you look at Chaos Brand versus, the physical debuff, you can make an argument those aren't really equivalent because a lot of our classes that feel like melee classes are actually doing a ton of magic damage, right? So at that point, right, like you feel like, all right, well, we're going down this road now and we can feel pretty locked in. And when you're pushing at the really, really high end, yeah, a couple percentage points is going to make the difference between I'm the best in the world at this key or not. I think most people, your individual skill is going to overshadow what those buffs and min-maxing those buffs is going to bring. But with that said, yeah, I do think this is something we could look at. I can take this to the team. Like I said, we've talked about Arcane Int and Chaos Brand in the past, all through Dragonflight, really. So I have to follow up with them. But I will say, if this ends up getting nerfed, you're gonna have to make like a tombstone of things that you've gotten nerfed.
Oh, come on, don't do that. This I've just now started. I haven't. Okay, well, okay. So that'll actually lead me into my next thing because I will do one for some people who think that I definitely got one of their abilities nerfed. So specifically about raid buffs too. Now that shamans have gotten one, I think there's an argument that like basically every class has a spot, and I know the one that has always been famously given for Death Knights, RIP AMZ, has been that that they have grips and no one else has grips, and this is true. I mean, you can see this with representation throughout raids so far, especially in raids. I think in Mythic Plus this is definitely not something that is relevant, but with the amount of stops there are. But in raid, you always need some kind of grip on an end boss or a second to last boss.
Right.
And because
Right.
of the way gearing works, you need to have one geared when you get to that boss. So they kind of get their spot in raid. But I
Yeah.
think, do you think there's potentially some of the same issue with DKs that was had with enhancement? Like you needed a shaman, but you really needed Wind Fury, and only enhancement brought it.
Serious question. Do you think they need that? Right? Because like raid buffs are a avenue to give people, access and availability, or feel like you should bring that class. But like, spoilers, yeah, I was eavesdropping before I came in, and you mentioned warlocks, right? Like, they have gateway, they have hellstones. That's not like a hour-long
It's not
buff,
an hour-long buff,
it's
but
really, really powerful.
it's something you
and
need. Yeah.
I do feel like grip, like you mentioned yourself, is very frequently one of those things that you're like, all right, we definitely need, grip. And need is too strong a word, right? But
Well,
there
no,
are
I agree
definitely
with
a lot
you.
of encounters that will, benefit greatly from having Death Knights with grip.
Yeah, so that actually brings me kind of into my question. So, Blood DKs have access to mass grip. DPS DKs do not. Blood DKs have a vastly shorter cooldown on their individual grip than both DKs do. The other DPS specs of DKs do. So, typically in a raid environment, not that this is something that all levels will do. Certainly, you could say the poddyc crew or top guilds or whatever might do this differently than others. But like on Fire-Rack, you needed grips. You would have needed the amount of DPS DKs you would have needed to equal one blood DK for doing the gripping job on that fight was enough to where you just brought blood and you didn't even think about it. So I guess the initial question I was going to ask was, especially with AMZ being stronger for blood and grips being stronger for blood, do you see potentially an enhancement style issue where like, yes, DKs have a raid buff, but really only for one of the specs most of the time?
Right. So you're saying only under the definition that we were just discussing, only blood DKs have a raid buff? Also, your chat's really mad about the ads right now.
Oh, I can turn those off. I had my chat not showing. I can turn ads off for this. Sorry. Yeah, they don't worry about them. They get mad about everything. That's just their thing. That's just their thing. But yeah, I guess to be like more clear in the question, recently we saw you guys acknowledge the enhancement thing, and you're like, okay, we get it. Like shamans, kind of Ellie and Resto have felt left out. I think from the DK community, what I've seen, and I'm wondering if you guys have seen feedback that they feel a similar way about blood, and historically this has kind of been true as well, where blood has been the class. Like it's like, oh, you need grips, I need a blood DK. When I'm looking at bringing in DK, it's blood unless blood is unplayable, because blood is, you could argue, like almost twice as good as a DPS DK at doing the thing that you're bringing them to do.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like, I guess a lot of that really just depends on the context of the encounter. I think, like you mentioned, Farak, that's a great example of one where, yeah, there was a lot of grips, and I'm sure the encounter designer who made that probably did that intentionally to, create a specific gameplay there. But I don't know. There's a lot of nuance and texture there. I do still feel like Death Knight grip is such a powerful thing. Not to mention they have Oh, sorry, I call it slappy hands. The other AOE grip. They do still have AMZ. There's a lot of utility there. But yeah, I mean, certainly that's something the team can look at. But I also do feel like ultimately there is a world where you can feel like they have a spot with things that are not just the hour-long buff. And
Yeah.
I think ideally there would be more classes like Warlock, like Grip, that have a really unique and interesting texture and utility that makes you want to bring them in certain situations that aren't pure percentage throughput.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I mean, you kind of teed it up for me, but I had to do one there for the DKs because they're still mad about the AMZ thing. And that tombstone comment was uncalled for. All good though. Okay, so we saw with Tindril and Firac, they were two bosses that were like super powerful and required a lot of nerfs. And I know they were like kind of felt like walls for people. We talked about this previously in an interview. I don't know if it was me and you, but I heard you with someone talk about like part of the issue with that might have also been there wasn't enough of a difficulty curve leading up from, Naimu and Laradar and it's Nimue, sorry, I'm pronouncing it wrong. Smolderon, right? And then it was just kind of like you got to Tindril, and there were so many boss nerfs. Is the new scaling like Hellstream's Warsong, whatever it's called, buff? Do you think part of that, and also the longer mythic track, giving you more of an eye level difference from when these bosses were first killed? Do you foresee having to nerf bosses less in this upcoming season? Is that a goal? Is that part of the goal of that? Or do you think that's just maybe like a side benefit? And if it's not the goal, what was like the main reason for adding that scaling raid power increase?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I forget if you and I talked about this, but Mythic raid in particular is almost like multiple raid difficulties within one, right? Like you've got the initial tier, you've got kind of those mid-raid blockers, and then you've got the end boss. And yeah, I mean, like ultimately, we never say, "Hey, we will nerf this boss on this date." We look at the data, right? We look at the pull count on the bosses. We look at the different skill levels and determine if that's within the range of what we're hoping for that encounter. And we're not looking to like change the frequency in which we look at the data and monitor this stuff just because this buff exists. But yeah, I mean, the hope is that we will need to nerf it less because of the changes that were implemented there.
Okay, cool. We're having our first heroic week in an expansion coming up, which I'm a huge fan of personally. Is this the plan going forward? It was kind of weird at the beginning when you announced it. It's like, this might be something we're doing at the beginning of the expansion. I know you're not going to announce, hey, we're doing this for the rest of time, but like, is this something that you think can exist in the future? Are you monitoring feedback for this time? Is this like a test? Or do you, like, what are the philosophies of like why you think a heroic week is better potentially than a simultaneous release?
So I will actually announce, because why not? I can. We don't actually plan to have a heroic week in season 2. We had a long discussion about how do we want to approach the seasonal unlocks in the War Within, and we talked about, hey, in Dragonflight we didn't have a heroic week. How do we get that planned out? What do we want to do moving forward? And a lot of things weigh into that conversation, but some of the things we discussed, and it really boils down to, at expansion launch, there's a lot of moving pieces, right? In terms of the tuning, there are a ton of class changes, there are new systems, and also most importantly, right? Like there's actually a ton of item levels, right? Like there's a huge amount of item level space in a relatively short time that players are progressing through, and we want to make sure that has time to breathe, right? Like the number of, item levels that you're essentially progressing through at the start of expansion looks very different than say in a season 2. And once you go into a season 2, you've had a lot of time to farm gear, and you're probably really ready for, that content to come out, and it doesn't need as much space to breathe, essentially. So ultimately, a lot of it comes down to pacing, and where we settled on was, yeah, let's have heroic week. That had some ramifications because of like the dungeon changes, like you mentioned. We used to have to lock Mythic Plus at like a really awkward level. It was like
plus 6 or plus 7
or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was plus 6, which is like, okay, well, with the new season 4 dungeon scaling, like there isn't even the equivalent of plus 6 anymore. We're kind of starting at a plus 10. So like, what does that mean? Do we just like, well, you can do Mythic Plus, but only Mythic Plus 2? Like, that's awkward. So we ended up just saying like, all right, let's just hold Mythic Plus and Mythic Raid in the same week, and then Mythic 0 has a daily lockout, like I mentioned, so there's a lot of opportunity to run those, run your normals, run your heroics, and it felt like, oh, Delves will open up at that point in terms of the other tiers, so there felt like there was a lot of content for people to really enjoy at that point. And yeah, with season 2, the plan is to currently not have a heroic week because it just doesn't feel like it needs it from a pacing perspective.
Okay. We've had around half an expansion with Augmentation Evoker now. Do you plan on adding any support classes in the future, or more of like that supportish kind of role? Not are you reworking classes, but like, is it something you guys have been happy with and could see going down that road again, or is it a one-off?
I'm not going to announce a new class.
Of course, yeah.
If that's what you're asking. I mean, right now, Aug has obviously had a lot of adjustments going into the War Within. We've actually, I would say, dipped our toes into some other kind of support effects with hero talents going into War Within. So certainly that's, I've learned over time to never say never. So that's certainly something that we'll keep in mind as we move forward, but nothing outside of some of the stuff that you might see in hero classes right now.
Okay. And I'm going to ask a question. This is something Dratnos has always been a huge fan of. Well, Dratnos is a great guy. He asks great questions. He's wondering, like, especially when you saw in Legion and in BFA, the best way to get artifact power was to spam these easy low-level keys. The best way to get Azerate power was to spam these islands all day, every day. It wasn't super challenging, but it was this thing you just did because it was the most efficient way to do it. That's kind of how aspect crests work now, in a way where like you often try to find the path of least resistance to get the most amount of these things possible. Something we've noticed is that when you fail the timer of a key, it makes it so you don't get a certain amount of crests. I think it's like you get it's basically meant as a reward for timing it that you get the extra crests. But do you see any potential concern with people not actually trying to do more relevant, more challenging content? Because the more chance you have to deplete, the like more you're pushing against your goal of your main goal of getting aspect crest. So it can make people kind of feel forced to do that. I guess the question is, how do you feel around the, I guess, penalty of not getting aspect crest if you don't time something?
Um, yeah. Let me think about this one for a second, because there's a lot to unpack there. Um, I guess, yeah, the way I'd approach this is ultimately, when designing World of Warcraft, and I touched on this earlier, you all play, I think, a very different game than a lot of other people, but
Mm-hmm.
with Mythic Plus in particular, and especially the reward system, it's about aligning the goals of the group, right? We want to make sure that everyone has skin in the game. And with a static group, right, like you all might see things like pushing score. Everyone's aligned there. We all want to push score. We don't want to deplete because our keystone depletes, and we all care about that keystone depleting. But like if you're in a pug, right, and like I said earlier, you just want loot or you want vault progress, you might not care about your score. You don't really care what happens to the key. We used to downrank the entire second item in the chest, if you remember, and we made some changes there. So
Mm-hmm.
instead of that, we want all the people in the group to care in terms of the rewards of the experience and the Mythic Plus group to complete the key in time, right? And everyone should be invested in, yes, we beat this timer by 90 seconds versus losing by 90 seconds, because that's something that is important for everyone to have aligned expectations, right? I think that's one of the things we've all learned over time. If there's misaligned expectations with a group, whether it be in WoW or other places, like it can lead to um, uh, problems.
Yeah.
So that's the main reason ultimately that we have had that the number of crests downgrading in there, and we felt like that was a change that we made rather than having that whole item downgrade that had enough impact to have people invested in the success of the group, but didn't feel overly punitive. Obviously, we're always listening to feedback, and we've made changes in the past. Not to say we never will again, but that's kind of the reason of why we do that.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and yeah, I guess to pivot off of that a little bit, um, I've said it a couple times. Like there are a million ways to play WoW, right? Like it's one of the things I love about World of Warcraft is I've said this in like other media outlets, whatever, but like you can only play like 10% of WoW
Mm-hmm.
and have a really, really awesome time. And that's one of both the joys and the challenges of making WoW is how do we make this game where you have such a broad audience, right? From people like the poddyc group to people who say only do outdoor content and don't do instance content, who you all have talked about a couple times now. Uh, but that's one of the things that we always have to think about, and that's one of the major challenges of WoW is there's always more that we want to do than we have time to do. So how do we kind of like strike a balance between making sure that there's content for people who might not ever want to touch a piece of instance content, or people who really really want to push keys really hard. And ultimately, when we talked about this in the Mythic Plus changes that we made in War Within, a lot of times where that leads us is to really take a step back and look at, making sure that we're not trying to come up with a one size fits all solution when there are very different audiences who have different
Yeah.
needs, right? Like what you all want with Mythic Plus looks different than what a lot of other people might want with Mythic Plus. So, that can cause friction, and we always want to try to find solutions that make the most people happy. But yeah, I just want to kind of
Yeah. You
touch on the like challenges that
Yeah,
we often have
you're
when
not
developing.
making a game for one group of people. You're trying to make a game that works for a million different facets of people that want different. I mean, you can see that a
Right.
lot too with like even since the end of last expansion going into this one. Think about how much more solo content you can do if you play this game literally as a solo RPG almost, right?
Yeah, yeah, for
Like
sure.
clearly that isn't intended at people who play this game at a super high level and always play in groups. Like there's a large group of people who play this game clearly, or else you guys wouldn't be doing this. That
Yeah.
play the game that way.
Yeah,
Um,
and I just want to talk about that just from the perspective of like when you think about like, all right, well, I play the game with, a static group, and you look at the penalties of Mythic Plus, it can feel like, well, we didn't time the key, so we didn't get our rating, and our collective key got downgraded. But I don't know, when you think about pugs and people who aren't playing in a static group or the same way, that calculus looks very different, and we have to try to design
Hmm.
for all of those groups. And it's fun. Like I mentioned, actually, delves are something that I've called out a few times in other interviews that I think is really interesting here. Like that is for a target audience that is people who don't ever want to push, you know, a queue button or go into Mythic Plus or raids. Like they just want to enjoy the game with them and maybe their partner or something. Um, and we want to make sure that delves are exciting for as many people as possible. And one of the things that we did through beta was actually added that, kind of challenge mode, almost Mage Tower-esque um, hard mode on the 13th delve to try to provide some interest and excitement for people who do really like a challenge, even though the rest of some of the delve progression they might zip through really quickly because they're like mythic raiders or something. But there should be something there that they can find interesting and exciting, and we try to find those solutions that you know hit as many audiences as possible without like you know skewing the initial intent and moving away from the goals of what some of the designs or pieces of content were originally.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think that something like the 13th Elver, if that's its official name, but that like
Zekvir's Lair.
yeah, Zekvir's Lair, that official thing. I also think that's something that isn't just for people who play this game at a super high level. Like even the Mage Tower is something that was very, very positively received by a lot of people in the community because they could have done it over the course of the expansion as they got more powerful, and it was like a challenge they could aspire to do. So I don't think it was like I think even the people who are primarily delves are designed for, I think will end up trying that as something they can do, especially with it being a solo thing. We have a little time left. I want to ask
Sure.
two questions specifically. You talked about making the game for different kind of people. I want to ask a question kind of specific to something that you have designed specifically for High Mythic Plus players. So like this is the first time you've really like created High Mythic Plus for High Mythic Plus. At a certain point the affixes go away. There's like the increased death timer. I was just going to ask a lot of the people
right.
that
Challenger's Burden.
yeah, something like that. I don't know what it's called, but the people who do higher Mythic Plus, a lot of their not concerns, but one big pain point this expansion was that it felt like, and this is a big reason why AUG was used for a long time because their defensive power was you weren't really worried about doing enough damage to time the key. You just needed to live. So the comp that you needed was just this hyper specific what class can live and also kind of do a good bit of damage, but it was really just like super tanky. Find a way. If you live through this key, it's going to be timed, and maybe some people wish that it was more like damage focused. But I guess my question is, going into the new expansion, you've tripled just for high Mythic Plus players. This is not both audiences. You've tripled the penalty for dying. I guess my question is, are you concerned that it could only compound that feeling that deaths are now so important that the only real thing you're doing in a high key is no matter what, you just cannot die under any circumstance? Is that an intentional angle, or did you feel that specifically deaths needed to be more punishing going into the war within?
Right. Yeah, I wish this is something we touched on a little bit more when we were discussing, the new round of affixes with Challengers Peril, Challengers Guile, whatever all of them are called. The actual like baseline timers for War Within Season 1 dungeons are a bit more forgiving, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not something we announced or talked about, but like I remember when the initial timers came out, there were like spreadsheets where people were saying Mythic Plus is going to take so much longer to run. Like, look at these timers and how much longer they are than the other seasons. But a lot of that was because we knew we wanted to have Challenger's Peril turn on later, and that was a way to make the baseline experience at lower keys a bit more forgiving and a bit more approachable while still rewarding execution at the higher end. And by higher end, I mean a lot of that affix was designed for 7 to 10, right? To your point, Challenger's Peril actually stays on at 12 plus, right? So it's a new affix. This is for sure something we want to keep an eye on, especially in that 12 plus space. There's totally a world where we revisit how it works. Maybe I shouldn't even say this because people get upset, and I'm not saying we're going to do this, but like maybe it should actually like reduce the keystone timer instead of make deaths more meaningful, just to add that mastery in that way. Or maybe we turn it off at 12. I don't know. There's a lot of things we could do up to and including like, actually this is awesome and people are enjoying this and it is achieving our goals. But yeah, that's kind of what the goal there was and how we were approaching that.
Okay, cool. And do we have time for one more question, or are you heading out of here?
Go for it. I think we got time. Yeah.
Okay, cool. They're not yelling at us to leave yet. Okay, so something I've actually been thinking about a lot is the changes that have been made from Dragonflight through the War Within as far as how trash works in dungeons. This does
Right.
apply to both low level keys and high level keys. And how much of an importance there was on stops in Mythic Plus, like things like Typhoons and Ring of Peace and Stuns and things like that. The way you saw those work last expansion, it's changed now, and maybe this is a way you're going to answer this question. But I guess what I was going to ask is, like, when you're designing a raid fight, you design mechanics to happen for a specific reason, and you have a very curated experience for the player, right? You can't just kick most raid mechanics or stop them, like,
Oh, okay,
right?
sure, yeah.
So, like, going into a trash pull, do you find it difficult to design what kind of experience you want that trash pull to be like? Because especially with different skill level groups, some people may be stopping literally everything from happening and they're pulling two things at once. Some groups may be not kicking anything and they're dealing with something crazy, right? So, like, I guess the question is, how difficult do you find designing between those two mediums? Is what you've added in this expansion a way to do that, adding a lot more power into specifically interrupts rather than stops? And yeah, I guess that kind of a weird question, but just kind of throwing
Yes.
out that general idea of
I
difficulty
think
with
I
that.
know what you're saying. Okay. I guess I'll start with the easy part of that, which is, ultimately we design trash very intentionally, right? With spells that, we might call filler spells, like they're just going to spam nukes and fireballs, versus creating not only individual creatures, but also abilities on those creatures that have very important abilities, right? And we want to make sure that those abilities have, a recast that is commensurate with the threat of it, as well as affordance in terms of like the visual being really loud, the cast time being really loud. Something we talk about a lot is like, hey, this thing, if this cast gets off and it wipes our group, why is it the same cast time as the fireball, right? Like
Yeah,
there
yeah,
has to be distinction there to make sure that there's affordance for the player to understand this is what the important thing to kick is, right? It should give you plenty of time to react to that. And then after that, we generally design those creatures and then kind of piece together the pulls in a way that allows the player's agency to kind of approach it like a puzzle, right? And often there are routes that get picked up where a lot of the routing is associated with like where kind of some of these scarier monsters are. And ultimately, like, yes, when you give players agency to do things, you have to kind of be okay with some of the outcomes, whether that be they come up with a crazy pull that you might have never intended to happen, all the way to, they're avoiding things entirely and, oh, that's not what we wanted, right? But when people have agency, we want them to be able to have that ability to make choices. I think it was Preach made a really cool video where he was discussing dungeon design of other MMOs, and I'm sure, I mean, you play a lot of MMOs, I'm sure you notice this. A lot of other games, their dungeons are just like, they stop you, right? There's literally a door. Like, all right, you pull up to the door, you stop, you AoE
Yeah.
it, door opens, move, right? Where WoW, we always want you to be able to have that agency, to be able to look around and make choices based on, your experience. And this also kind of gets back to that like conversation we were having earlier, where some people enjoy that kind of puzzle of approaching the dungeon, and then often with Mythic Plus seasons, it gets solved a little bit through the season, and then that's kind of the approach. But that was also a big reason why we moved into the world where we're trying to refresh the seasonal pool of dungeons every season now, where you're always seeing new dungeons, because that puzzle is really interesting to kind of solve every season. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
No,
that
I
was
think
my
that's
correct.
excellent insight. I mean, I gave you that was
Okay.
an awful. I tying that into a question was something I did not do well there. But I think you discussed everything that I was trying to get at. So thank you. All right. Well, that is Alex sent me the funniest thing when I said, "Oh, we can do one more question." Yeah, he was like, "Please don't do that." So I'll let you go here. But thank you for your time. That was really insightful.
Awesome.
Always love our conversations. Thank you.
All right, man. Always a great time. Good to see you. Until next time.
Yeah. Until next time. Yep. See you later.
All right, bye-bye.
Yep.